Hello everyone and welcome to Inform Friday. I'm Lila Angelaka and I work for Historic Environment Scotland in the technical research team. If you're new to this and you're joining in for the first time, this is a series of discussions about traditional buildings where we are presenting a short topic each time followed by a live Q&A. And we also introduce you to our Inform Guide series. So each session is corresponding to one or more of our published guides, which are basically short publications giving technical advice for homeowners and covering the basics on a number of topics. In our previous live streams this autumn, which were focused around climate change, since we're during the COP26 event right now, we talked about the importance of ventilation in traditional buildings. We talked about rainwater goods and how they cope in a changing climate, which indicates increased precipitation and occurrence of severe weather events. So part of our effort against climate change and reducing CO2 emissions under the EU National Energy Savings Targets, which came into force in 2019, commits us to improving energy efficiency in our homes. And all buildings must play their part in this. So since 2008, we have been taking the lead in trialing and demonstrating improvements to historic and traditional buildings through over 30 refurbishment case studies. So today we will introduce you to some of these measures to improve the thermal performance of traditional buildings through one of our latest case studies, Holyrood Park Lodge. As usual, if you would like to ask us a question, you can do this now via our Facebook page or log into our YouTube channel with your Google account. And the event is recorded as well as the previous ones, so you can watch it at your own leisure. If we don't manage to answer your question today or is something quite specific, we will try to either do this at the next session or you can just email us at technicalresearch@ags.scot. So it's time to welcome Roger Curtis, our main man. And hi, Roger.
Hello, hi.
So I will first give a short introduction how you can thermally improve your older building by using, as an example, one of our latest pilot projects, Holyrood Park Lodge. And Roger will be here to answer all of your burning questions afterwards.
I think there's a whole stack of them, but that's fine. That's what we're here for.
That's great. So just to give an introduction about Holyrood Park Lodge, it's a Victorian building dating from the mid-19th century and is designated a Category B. It's also within the Holyrood Park Statue Monument area and within a design landscape. So quite a lot of designations there. So generally, older buildings are thought of as poor energy performers or hard to treat. And this building is typical of many traditional solid wall masonry buildings. So that's why we chose it as one of our projects. And we actually improved the building's performance by 103%. It was band F and it went to band C. So that's what the energy performance certificate looks like for those of you who prefer it in a more visual way. So quite a big improvement. And the approach was sort of a sensitive upgrade and restoration scheme. So we removed 80s alterations and we tried to restore traditional elements. We chose to insulate the envelope internally using vapor permeable and naturally derived or compostable insulation materials. So we're going to start by showing what we did to the floors because it's quite important to have warm feet to feel warm. So the floors at ground level were insulated with wood fiber board insulation, which went underneath existing timber suspended floors. So this wood fiber board is actually a vapor open material, which is semi-rigid. We used one that was 100 millimeters thick, but you can get in different thicknesses. And it was cut to the right size to fit between the joists. And the next image you see, which I actually showed before, you can actually see how they fit between the joists. So the floorboards were lifted and the floor void was also cleaned out prior to doing this. And everywhere the lodge, the floorboards were actually repaired and reused. We had to get some new ones as well from a Scottish supplier, but most of them were used if we could. So besides wood fiber boards, there are other compatible materials as well, such as hemp boards. But hemp pads and wood fiber board have been shown in our trials to be appropriate for the installation of timber floors. And with the 80 mm wood fiber board, you can get a U value improvement from 2.4 to 0.7 for those of you who are more technical. But generally, a material which allows some degree of moisture movement should be used. If you're insulated solid floor, rather than suspended floors, you can either use an insulation board, such as an aerogel, which you'll see on the next image being laid, this one, or you can use insulated lime concrete, either by mixing the insulation material with basically the concrete. So hemp, you can use, or recycled glass, or you can lay the insulated layer and then sort of under the concrete layer. And that's called like a lightweight expanded clay aggregate. So this is quite a good option, as you can see here in this image, when you're putting underfloor heating. And if you want, you can add any flagstones on top of it. So moving on to the roof, typically around 25% of heat is lost through the roof of buildings. So loft insulation is an effective and quite common way of reducing heat loss. And again, natural materials are preferable for moisture buffering and preventing condensation. So we also use wood fiber boards here, but we also trial some hemp pads. The insulation you see here was placed between the rafters, which gives us what we call a warm roof. And this is quite good when you use your attic or you use it for storage. And the boards here can be seen in place between the rafters. They are held by timber runners. You can see the sort of more light colored wood. And these are fastened to the cheeks of the rafters. The rafters can be deepened if required, if you wish to put, if they're thin, or you wish to put like a thicker insulation. Some areas of the lodge, due to having no or limited access to them, the insulation was installed between the ceiling joists, which is basically what we call a cold roof. Wood fiber again was used, but also hemp insulation, just to trial both materials. And this is an image where you can actually see the hemp pads being laid between the joists, and I think that was above the bay windows. In areas where the roof structure was visible, if you have something like that, it can be covered in plywood and painted with clay paint, although you are reducing a bit of the sort of moisture movement with the plywood. At the lodge, we also insulated the sloping ceilings, which in Scotland, these are called coombs, and they're basically rooms that sit under the roof pitch. They're often a difficult area to insulate, and they present also an additional level of complexity when carrying out energy assessments. But we had access from the attics, so we went up the attic and we actually slid the material down from the space above. And the wood fiber is actually quite soft and flexible enough to pass by variations in the thickness of the rafters. But there are also other methods, and the next image is actually from the roof, I think at the entrance of Stirling, where the aerogel insulation is placed on top of the sarking. I'm gonna quickly move to the wall insulation, which in older buildings, because of the expense and disruption, this should only be considered if all other energy efficiency measures have been adopted. And in tests conducted by HES, average U values of uninsulated walls are in the region of 1.5 to 1.2, which is actually considerably better than the standard calculation result of 2.5. However, it is accepted that some improvement is necessary, especially where there are larger areas of masonry and there are no windows openings, such as gable walls. At the lodge, we already had the original lath and plaster linings in most areas, so we decided to use a blown material that would sit behind these linings. And this method has been trialed in several HES projects, and it's kind of a simple way of improving thermal performance whilst allowing the retention of original lath and plaster linings. At the lodge, the gap between the lath and plaster was actually quite narrow, about 38 millimeters. So to achieve a reasonable fill in the void, we had to drill quite a few holes. So that implies quite a bit of redecoration, but it can be less disruptive than other methods, and it allows you to keep your original linings. But the important part of this solution is that the wall remains vapor open and capillary active. That means that the external masonry is free of cement pointing or any other layer that might inhibit moisture dispersal. So this material basically is a blown material called cellulose fiber, which is basically shredded newspaper, and you can see in the image before how it sits basically between on the top left corner. That's the shredded newspaper, the cellulose fiber, and you can see how it sits on top of the masonry wall, and just behind the lath. There are other materials you can use for your walls, either blown or in a rigid form, such as boards. So when you don't have linings or you don't have the original one and you're stripping everything out, there are other options too. So the choice of materials will largely depend on the existing makeup of your walls, your budget, and other factors. For rubble walls that are actually unplastered or have been plastered on the hard, a good option is to replace with insulated lime plaster. This material can be mixed in with the lime. The insulation material can be mixed in with a lime plaster. You can use hemp or something else, and you can buy this pre-mixed, or you can mix it on the spot. Moving on to the windows. So at the lodge, the windows were all single glazed casement type windows of different dates, but mostly as part of the 95 repair works. But all the frames and casements were in good condition, so we decided to keep them and just upgrade the glass with slim profile double glazed units from a Scottish supplier. We have done a previous live stream about windows where we spoke about different approaches to upgrading windows. So if you want to hear more, you can actually check that on YouTube along with the other Inform Fridays. And there we spoke about shutters and how they're important if you have them, and they can reduce heat loss by 51%. If needed, they can also be upgraded with aerogel boards, but also blinds and curtains can control drafts and reduce heat loss by 14%. Unfortunately, they don't count on the EPC, but they will make a difference. Draft stripping is a no-brainer, especially in windy places like Scotland. And if you're looking for something more, there is fixed or operable secondary glazing. There are the magnet type ones. There are foam ones. So there's different options actually to fit secondary glazing. But you can also fit slim profile double glazing in existing sashes. You can use vacuum paints. Just to say, the technology is progressing even on that front. So nowadays there are various options that you can choose from. And on that note, just to say that we had quite a few questions across social media about double glazing being allowed, excuse me, in listed properties or conservation areas. I mean, every council they make their own decisions and they have their own guidance, which can sometimes differ from council to council. But normally, there's more flexibility about this unless there is historic glass, which we normally mean early crown glass, which is quite rare nowadays. Similarly to the windows, the doors of the lodge were draft stripped, external doors, and aerogel board was added to the filled panels of the door. So aerogel, we showed it a bit before, but it can be quite thin. This one was 5 millimeters thick, and it's good for when you don't have much width to work with. So this was added to the filled panels and then covered with a thin plywood and painted over. All timber beading and door moldings were left in place, and the existing hardware was retained. As we mentioned in our previous live in September, providing ventilation is really important, especially following installation work, to avoid condensation issues. So at the lodge, we reopened block windows, such as this small quarter light at high level, and it was modified to be operable with a pulley, so it's kind of easy to maintain as well. We also added grill flue vents where we couldn't reinstate the fireplaces. So this one you see here is a hit and miss grill, which you can close it off if it's really drafty and windy on a particular time of the year. And we also cleaned and cleared external ground level vents to allow sufficient levels of ventilation throughout the building. We also reinstated the fireplace in this room that you can see here, which is used as our meeting room, with a new stone surround to the hearth. And we use a salvage cast iron instead. The other important thing is this steel damper, which was fitted to control draft. So surprisingly, this detail contributed to a few points in the EPC. So part of the research work at the lodge involved long-term monitoring, which examined internal and external conditions of the building before and after the works. And this included U-value testing, so basically that is how fast heat transfers through a structure, hygrothermal monitoring, which has to do with temperature and humidity, and air tightness testing. So the monitoring continued until I think this summer, so for over 2 years. And generally, it showed a much lower relative humidity level post-refurbishment and when the building is heated. So the photo here is actually, you can see the equipment when it was up. So this supports the theory that where vapor and capillary active materials are used, internal humidity is controlled. And assuming the building is winter watertight, moisture will not build up. The improvement in the thermal performance of the wall was about 39% after the works. And as we mentioned earlier, the building was a band F, which is low but quite typical of uninsulated traditional buildings. And after the works, the EPC reached the band C, which is quite an improvement and without any loss of historic fabric. We have actually done some additional work lately that would actually take us a few points even higher. And if you want to read a bit more about the case study, please go and see in our publications, Case Study 37, Hollywood Park Lodge. And we may be publishing a technical paper on the monitoring in the future. So just to end, so obviously in cities there are district heating schemes, so it may be easier to reach the required energy standards in the EPC, but in rural properties which are off the gas grid, the use of renewables or other energy storage may be needed to get that certain level. At the lodge, actually, a further phase is planned for 2022 to improve the EPC score even further and make it sort of more appropriate as an off-the-gas grid building. So this will likely involve the use of a renewable system, such as an earth source heat pump. So what's the space for that one? So that's it from me, a very quick run through, but we will now get to more specific questions. And on that note, just to say that next week we will have a brand new energy retrofit guide, which will talk about all of these issues in more detail. So stay tuned.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Thank you, Lila. So that's covering some of the options at the lodge and indeed other options too, which will be in the revised guide. Some of you may know the existing short guide 1, and we were going to call this new one another short guide, but it's not very short. It's 90 pages of gripping reading with quite a lot more context about embodied carbon and the circular economy, which is quite significant in terms of how we choose materials. There's lots of materials out there that are very good insulators. That's not the question. The wider question is what materials are best for the circular economy and how it can fit in with a transition to low carbon measures, which are sort of whole life low carbon, that is. So some considerations there at the beginning of the new volume, as well as a few extra examples that Lila touched on, particularly insulated plasters and other options for walls and floors. I think probably happy to go into the questions now. I think
we have quite a lot, so let's see how much we will manage.
Let's just bring them on.
Okay, so we have one from Fionn. So it's more about planning. When planning permission for change of use kicks in, that means sound, fire, thermal insulation, amongst other things. this work can be quite invasive regarding both fabric and character of the interior of listed buildings. Is this taken into account in current guidance being offered, and have you considered providing standard examples of how works might be undertaken which would gain listed building consent approval?
So this is about the tension between the requirements of the building regulations when a building warrant applies, listed building consent when you have a conservation type property and considerations, and how do you merge those two? And I'd like to say that all of the measures in the retrofit guide are listed building compliant, if that's the right word, depending on the nature of your fabric. But also we developed this guidance in association with Building Standards Division, and they are technically comfortable with these measures. So for most of this, the building control officer should be fine. I do know in conversion that there are additional factors like fire and noise that was mentioned in Fion's request. We have a document called Guide for Practitioners 6, application of the Scottish Building Standards, which was put out quite a long time ago now. And to answer her question, yes, the intention is to develop a document which has a set of, this is what the situation was, this is how they achieved compliance with the building regulations in this particular situation, with an outline of what that measure is. We're not going to do people's design solutions for them, but we're going to give indicative areas of where compliance was achieved.
Great.
Yeah. Okay. Next one. I see the chat is piling up the questions, so just keep them coming.
So we have one from Flora on YouTube. She would be interested in hearing about the possibility of installing solar panels on an M roof on a flat in a listed building in central Edinburgh. Right.
So as some of you know, a lot of the roof types in Edinburgh from the 1840s to the 1860s or so had a sort of two roofs with a gap in the middle, which gives you this central sort of quite hidden area. We worked with an organization called Changeworks back in 2010, and they put on some solar thermal units in that M-shaped roof under a scheme called Energy Heritage, which you can find on the internet. That was a Category B listed building. So I think City of Edinburgh Council will obviously look at such applications. We don't decide. It's not HES's job in Edinburgh to do the planning like this now. They've been delegated it directly. But I'm sure that where you have that situation, an M-shaped roof is not a bad place to put things. And indeed, for those who look at the planning portal for City of Edinburgh Council, you might have noticed that Historic Environment Scotland have applied for some solar PV units on some parts of Edinburgh Castle. So it's a very valid question, and with appropriate thought and sensitivity, I'm sure it can work reasonably well.
And on the note of renewables, we had a question from Chris emailed to us, and he would like to know our thoughts on integration of heat pumps to pre-1919 buildings. Any good examples to consider, and any concerns around code, etc.?
I think it slightly depends on where you are in Scotland. The coefficient efficiency for heat pumps has improved, particularly with air source. And if you're in a reasonably modest maritime climate like we are in most of it, generally fine, you do need to make sure that your insulation work and your draft proofing work is up to scratch, because they deliver a slightly lower temperature of heat to your radiators or your underfloor. And therefore, what you don't want is the heat pump to be working very hard courtesy of your electricity bill. You want it to be able to keep up with the demand, so that the water goes around the system at a slightly lower temperature. So you do need to have the insulation right. We are looking actively at renewable options, specifically heat pumps for the Holyrood Park Lodge. That might be an air source heat pump. That might be a ground source option, whether it's drilling or whether it's in a coil. There are archaeological considerations because of the part of Edinburgh we're in, but we'll look at that. So no, it's a valid question, and I suspect there will be many questions. As for examples, we've sponsored a case study on a church in the west of Scotland. It was Kilninver Church. I can't quite remember the case study number. Leela will remind me, where that was an air source heat pump that kept the church at about 12, 13 degrees. And then we boosted the heat for the congregation when they were there with radiant panels. And that's quite a nice combination. I think that worked quite well. It was a while ago now, so I suspect things have moved on, technology's improved. But as you say, heat pumps will be with us, and we need to make sure we integrate them appropriately. In terms of the plumbing, getting them in physically, they're not terribly big. There's a bit of a noise consideration. And I think if you have a whole tenement with everybody having those at the back humming away, that might be a factor. So kind of work in progress, but the principle, I think, is fine.
That's great, thank you. So another question that was emailed by Andrew, they have reservations about using open cell foam. Has it proven to be a not so suitable option sort of 10 years down the line?
We've used various foams behind wall linings, certainly, and the results have been very positive. It's a good insulator, and open cell will disperse or allow moisture to disperse. We've worked it on walls. We've not done it on other parts of the building, partly because we've got better options in our view, so we can use wood fibre on the floors and roof areas, be that wood fibre board or hemp board, or indeed various combinations of cotton products to produce insulation boards. So it's got its place, but like everything, we've got a preferred route where we've got a reasonable alternative.
That's good, thank you. So we had a comment/question asking, wood fibre board, no vapor barrier?
It depends what you mean by a vapor barrier. So in terms of vapor barrier, we don't use vapor barriers at all in our work, because the principle of most traditional building fabric is that it is vapor open, and moisture highs are able to disperse freely as they did when they get built and when the other parts of the wall gets wet. But there are places for what is called an AVCL, an active vapor control layer, and certainly to comply with various elements for high-end modeling of energy performance, it is often preferred for an AVCL to be put in, particularly where you cannot guarantee the airtightness of your wood fibre. So, for example, on the floor there, we were comfortable that we were getting quite high push tolerances with the wood fibre between the joists. I will admit, though, in the roof at Holyrood Park Lodge, particularly in the cold roof area, that could have been done a bit more snug, and a way of addressing those accuracy of cutting is to use an AVCL, and probably we're going to do that up in parts of the roof there, just to really get that, to stop bulk air movement. We're not stopping movement of vapor and diffusion. We're stopping just drafts, basically. That's what we're in the business of doing, not excluding with vapor barriers, which would be a plastic sheet or something similar. So what's next? There's a stack of questions on the chat, but keep going.
Yeah,
keep going.
There is a question about draft proofing and cold bridges, but it came early, so I'm guessing that we covered draft proofing. But can you speak a little bit about cold bridges? Yeah,
if you have, so you notice this particularly where you have quite strong differentials in for example, wall thickness, and the splays on windows is the obvious place, and you'll see that quite often in empty buildings where they're not heated, where the the relative humidity is very high, and you'll quite often see condensation and damp right where the window junction, because the wall is incredibly thin there. In those areas, we've tended to use aerogels and sort of high-performing insulation to cover those areas where you need to have something. Most cold bridging, you've got to work pretty hard to have such a deleterious effect. So you address it, and as long as you have a reasonably high, sensible levels of relative humidity, you don't get issues.
Okay. Next question is from Hannah on YouTube, but I don't think we can fully address that. It's a bigger issue. She's interested to know our thoughts on Edinburgh and Newtown flats, energy efficiency in UNESCO areas, listed buildings, roof insulation.
Yeah, I think we're back to these general measures. So at Holyrood Park Lodge, which was in all of those areas that was mentioned, we achieved some reasonable upgrades to the building fabric. As we said, it's EPC band C, could go higher with renewables. I think there are considerations about 40 heat pumps on the back elevation of buildings. And maybe there are various district heating schemes that might be more appropriate for dense housing, like particularly in Edinburgh. But I think the message is it's not no to any particular technology. It's what's the best technology to fit within that grouping of buildings. And I think tenements themselves lend themselves more to collective measures. So district schemes, maybe even collective systems of PV, solar and thermal on the roof too, as an option. So it'll be a mixture of things, but I'm not saying anything is off. And certainly the measures at the lodge could be applied in many other parts of Edinburgh too.
We had another question that was emailed in by Bruce. So he's in a 1910 tenement with single thickness stone walls. They have a wood burner that's about 10 years old and they want to replace. They also have gas central heating, a 3-year-old boiler. Any advice welcome. Just to say before Roger speaks that we will have some links put in the chat, like the Energy Saving Trust and companies that you can actually get advice for issues like that.
So it's very hard to jump into specific cases in a forum like this, but certainly a wood burning stove in an urban context is quite a sensitive one because of the particulate quality for the air quality in the city. Although I understand that modern wood burning stoves are very efficient or very effective at burning, and the particulate emissions is very low. But needless to say, the insulation of the property is probably the number one. We've mentioned blown measures, and later tenements tended to have quite high glazed areas, so the windows are very dominant on an elevation. And I think various glazing upgrade options and draft proofing options are probably quite high on your list. Maybe glazing even comes first. We've got a training rig being delivered to Edinburgh, hopefully today, which some of you guys can look at Lauriston Place next week, 11th and 12th, and that'll have a few glazing options, and indeed it'll show some of the wall options that you could think about. As for gas boilers, we know that they are by way of being essentially phased out over the next period of years. So a judgment to be made about when you replace that and how you do it, and if you replace it, what do you replace it with? A little bit of work in progress, I think, on heat pumps, as I've indicated, but it sounds like you're at the sort of the right thinking point, and maybe you're at the data gathering stage to get a feeling for what options you might have. But if it's a fairly new boiler, there's no particular obligation to replace it just now.
Which you actually answered a few other questions that were similar to this, from people being worried that if gas central heating is no longer allowed, what will happen? How are we gonna keep ourselves warm? But yeah, it's not gonna be just basically one day saying gas central heating is not allowed. It's a phasing out, as Roger pointed out. And a question from Leanne on Facebook. How do you find a contractor to do this blown cellulose fiber? It's the first time I have heard of this.
There's a few of them in the Central Belt. I think there's a couple. I know EcoCell is one of them. And who else does it? I can't remember who did it for the lodge. I should.
I think it was WarmCell, but you can Google cellulose fiber.
Yeah, WarmCell's the product, and a range of BCA Insulation also did it. They're based in Shotts. Okay, I think I'm picking up with the inquiries on the chat there, so just keep coming.
Yeah, so Sandra on Facebook, she's asking, our roofer has suggested mineral glass wool. I'm nervous about moisture on the rafters, particularly above the bathroom. Would this be an issue even with breathable mineral wool?
The thing with mineral wool is it's because it is what it says it is. It's a mineral product. It doesn't buffer and absorb and diesel moisture in the same way that a natural material does. So there's a consideration. It's a very good insulator as such. It's just where you want to go with your your materials choices, and to some extent that's for you to articulate as a client, and what you want. Generally, we're following circular economy principles, and perhaps for some of you to get a bit of detail on that's principles outlined by Zero Waste Scotland, and this is about the flow of materials in the construction supply chain from origin to use to disposal of surplus product, and how that breaks down, i.e. is it compostable or not, and then what you do with the product at the end of its life. So go to Zero Waste Scotland for a sort of more detailed review of what the circular economy means and where retrofit can fit into that. So no, suggest to your roofer that you what about some other products, and see what they say.
And if not, just get other quotes from other roofers. Another question from Matthew on Facebook. Have you looked into thermofleece? I think it has less risk of damp because the wool can absorb and release moisture, but probably more expensive.
Yeah, I mean, products from sheep's wool have been around for a long time. There's many different types. Thermofleece is just one. The key with these ones is the insect protection that needs to be built into it, which is all fine. Edinburgh Castle has a stack of sheep's wool in its attics, and that's doing all right. What Matthew has correctly identified is you need to make sure that the relative humidity in that space is kept reasonable, and that means some decent ventilation and airflow. Otherwise, you do create the wrong conditions, bothly for the timber and your building fabric, but also for the wool, and then you'll get moths joining the party.
A question from Ian on YouTube. Would you be able to provide a list of suppliers of wood fiber board, hemp insulation, cellulose, etc.?
Yeah, all that stuff. It's a fair question. We're not allowed to, we're not able to, as a public body, to specifically recommend individuals. With information capture and searching being what it is now, what we prefer to do is indicate the typology of products that we mean. So the various materials, wood fibers, hemp boards, hemp fibers, hemp wools, sheep's wool, all that stuff, lime, insulated lime concrete, insulated lime plaster, the sort of things that we've looked at. Now, we can't look at every insulation and construction material and test it on your behalf and tell you what to do. We can only follow the approaches that the circular economy and our own building conservation principles set us to. The retrofit guide talks about these materials in their generic terms, so we leave it for the consumer and the designer and the architect to take that further with their own searching and knowledge.
A question from Paul on Facebook. What material is best to insulate between ceiling and rooms above? I assume we're talking about a detached building rather than...
Yeah, this is often you'll have an existing arrangement of what is called deafening, which is a sort of lime, ash, sometimes sawdust layer, which is all about acoustic insulation between properties and between floors in buildings. That is a pretty good insulator in its own right, but if that's not there, as you've seen from Leela's presentation, we've used the wood fiber, we've used hemp board, and the wools, the various types of wool as well, and indeed many other products that fit suit between those gaps. Our training rig that we'll have at Lauriston Place at the Space, SPACE, the Space exhibition in the old fire station at Lauriston Place, that has a mock-up of a floor with insulation bats laid between it. So please come and have a look.
Great. So a question from Adam on YouTube. Is the reason you use natural materials because we are moving to more sustainable living and building?
Short answer, yes. Under the principles of circularity, which many other organisations are talking about. Sustainable Development Foundation has got an awful lot on this. Zero Waste Scotland that I mentioned as well. So yes, that's the general direction of travel.
Right. We had a question mailed in. It's quite lengthy, so we will only sort of pick the part that is relevant to other people in the audience. So it's about adding a breathable membrane to avoid wind washing and hold insulation, whether that is natural fiber or glass, mineral wool, just to have about having a breathable membrane in place. And he is asking about basically the difference between the rigid wood fiberboard insulation or having sort of glass mineral wool, which we partly answer that, but I
Yeah,
think
these are material selection questions. If for me, the wall insulation question is predicated on what lining do you have. If you've got a historic or traditional lining, kind of keep it, because that's what I do. That's what I'm going to say. And if you don't, you've really got quite a lot of options. Insulated lime plaster is a very good one. Blowing in various materials behind your existing material, whether it's plasterboard. If it's foil back plasterboard, that's not quite so good because you've got a barrier there. So yeah, I want to be cautious about being too specific.
yeah.
But certainly with blown in materials, you have to be absolutely certain that that wall is dry and in good condition. It is talked about sometimes that you have sort of bridges for the damp from the masonry through to the lining. And I say, if my wall is that wet, I wouldn't even be living in the building, let alone insulating it. Your walls should generally be dry. And if it's wet on the inside face, I would suggest you have a very serious water ingress problem. Often defective rainwater goods, gable ends, poor detailing. And we've got an informed guide on wet gables, which is kind of the flip side to the insulation question or problem, and that your building fabric needs to be performing. Climate change adaptation, increased rainfall that Leela mentioned, we've got to solve that for the building fabric before we look at the insulation options. Now the two go together, because if you get your renders, your protection, your pointing, your masonry right, you have a drier, better performing wall. So it's all very much tied up on that. I've lost myself on the chat here. Where are we?
It's so the next question is by Nick on YouTube, similar to one we've heard before. So they have windstone walls, plasterboard lining, very irregular cavity of about 50 millimeters. So they're interested in general considerations for using blown-in insulation.
For me, that's probably a question of the condition of the plasterboard. Was it well done? Does it have a sheet of plastic behind? Because it might well do. And if it is, maybe not the blown material. It might be foil backed, as I said. Think about that quite carefully. But with a 50 mil gap, you can get quite a lot of insulation material in there. So I'm sure there is a potential for considerable improvement. If that lining is not good, or you don't want to keep it, or the condition is poor, again, we have measures for on the hard. Quite a few wood fiber systems go directly onto masonry now. The Pavatherm system does that, or insulated lime plaster, as from that image that Leela showed you. That was a refurbishment case study called Downey's Cottage, where we did that. It goes well for vernacular context, where you've got quite small buildings with what you might call slightly bumpy walls. There's the first coat going on. I think that went out to about 60 to 80 mil, in fact, in total. That's come out really well, really nice inside.
It's case study 22 if anyone wants to check that out.
Okay.
Yeah, the next question is from Al on Facebook. How do we insulate an 1890s Marchmont Edinburgh tenement flat roof, especially when the other owners aren't interested?
Yeah, this is quite a hard one, because although you may be in the top flat, I don't think under the way that tenements are designed, you don't actually own the roof. The roof is jointly owned with all the others. Leela, you know about this because you've had some common repair fun and games.
Yeah, that's true.
Also, it's a flat roof. It's effectively probably felt or zinc or maybe even lead. We've got to put our hand up here and say we haven't done a lot of flat roof insulation, and I think we should do. the current thinking with flat roofs is you have a good sized air gap, so sort of 50, 60 mil air gap. Your insulation then sits below that, and that air cavity, that area underneath the flatness, as it were, is quite generously ventilated to the outside. So the roof bit keeps the water out, and your insulation is the internal layer. And obviously that needs to be pretty meaty. We're looking at, I would suggest, a 200 mil, maybe that's 2 layers of wood fiber, which would be good for this actually. But let's remember how you get sanction and approval to do this in your tenement context. I might route you to the Under One Roof website, which is about helping tenement people who live in tenements in Scotland get collective action on maintenance.
Yeah, we can put the link, but it's more about maintenance and upgrades. But I think the discussion on insulation and upgrading the energy performance will come soon. Maybe not yet there.
Yeah. So, but it does give an idea about how you persuade other residents in the snare to kind of help, because it's their roof too. Although you're sharing the pain of it because you're at the top. Okay. Exactly. Should we go on to the next one?
Yeah, I'm gonna just ask about a question that we received on an email, and it's actually two questions. One of them is, will injection of some form of insulation behind lithoplaster cause a barrier to debris freely falling down behind the lithoplaster, and thus allowing a debris bridge to build up, which might transmit moisture?
Right. This is about the wet wall question. So my contention to that, or my response, is that wall should not be wet enough that it comes across. You see it quite often at ground floor level when the earth on the outside is risen up too high and the bottom of that wall genuinely is almost damp to the touch, and that does happen, but that's not what should happen. Of course, if you have material in the cavity pushing back against the material, it can't fall off anymore. So you've sort of addressed that, essentially created a slightly thicker wall. Let's remember that Scottish walls in most Scottish buildings are 600, 550, 600, 650, sometimes even more thick. And they are not thermally bad performers as such, as Leila indicated at the beginning. You could probably have a U value of 1.2, maybe even 0.9 with an existing wall if it's thick enough. And one has to make a decision where you put your money, where do you put your effort. I do accept that the EPC assessment will, you'll lose quite a few SAT points if you don't do the walls. But I think there is a cognizance that in fact the walls are not massive. They are part of heat loss, of course they are, but there are many other areas that you may want to address first and see how you get on.
The second question is, are there any suitable rolls of material, like rolls of wallpaper, which can be easily attached to the inner surface of uneven rafters? So this is about rafters, which would create an air barrier, so acting like secondary glazing or curtains at windows.
I think probably with that one, the way to do it is to do the insulation boards between the rafters, flush with the lower plane of the rafter, and then have your AVCL stapled or fastened with battens onto the front face of that, so it's all on one plane. I think if you did the air tightness measure alone, which is fine, but I think if you're going to do that sort of work in that sort of space, you might as well have a go at some sort of insulation as well. That would be my suggestion.
Okay, we have quite a lot of questions, so I'll try to kind of run through as many as we can. Next one is David on Facebook. Could you please comment on the efficiency of heat pumps and/or MHRV in pre-1900 structures where breathability of the envelope is a key factor? Right,
so this comes back to an earlier comment about the thermal envelope needing to be pretty good when you're using a heat pump, because their coefficient of efficiency is to keep that high, you need to have good insulation. We need to draw a distinction between air leakage, i.e. drafts and losing your warm air, with fabric breathability, which is about moving water vapor at capillary level. So that's not about air movement, that's about vapor movement. So you can have a very breathable, vapor open structure that is still very airtight. So that should not be a limiting factor in itself. But the insulation is a limiting factor, yes. and it needs to be good.
Next question is by Jez on Facebook. Would be interested in hearing more about hybrid systems that work in older homes, like the one you mentioned. I'm not sure what they mean about hybrid systems, though.
I think this is about heating and that sort of thing. So, for example, at Hollywood Park Lodge, we are probably going to look at something that includes energy storage, grid demand or grid balancing. So, what time do you purchase your power? When do you store it? And when do you use it? And how that feeds in with what could well be an air source heat pump, maybe, or photovoltaics. And there is, as we've discussed earlier, there is plenty of PV opportunities. So that would be a hybrid system. And I'm hoping in 2 years' time or a year and a half's time, we could have a pretty good plan and maybe something even delivered with a hybrid system at Hollywood Park Lodge. But I'm not quite at that level of expertise yet, I'm afraid.
Next question by Jamie on YouTube. Converting Kirk in the cairngorms and have an option for adding cork balls as part of the concrete slab we have to put in. Have there been any studies you have done on using cork within a floor?
No, but this is a question about the insulation material that goes within the concrete itself. And we've done quite a lot of lime concrete work. We prefer lime concrete because it is able to shift a bit of vapor from the solum, from the buried bits of your building, and get it free and away. If you keep the base of your building, that'll mean it's dry. You don't have wet layers. What material goes into the concrete as aggregate varies depending on what supplier you have. Cork is an excellent material, insulation material. So is foamed glass. So are lacquer pellets. There are quite a range of aggregates that you can put into concrete to give improved insulation. At a pilot building in Dunbar, which I've totally failed to write up and report about yet, we put shredded hemp in the lime plaster to give us our wall insulation, and we had foamed glass in the lime concrete for the floors, and both of which are doing really well. So I couldn't really comment on cork specifically, but I'm sure if it's a good insulator in the right concrete mix, I'm sure it would be just fine. People use cork in many different ways. It's one of those natural products that needs a home, and I think probably has probably got potential for elsewhere as well.
A detailed question from Paul on Facebook, which I'm not going to go into the details of it, but they've basically inserted Celotex PIR boards between the joists in the roof in the attic. However, there is a 25 millimeters layer of wool between the top of the lath and plaster ceiling and the bottom of the insulation board. Is that likely to be sufficient to allow any moisture to dissipate?
I don't know, because that's the sort of hybrid arrangement, and I do know of condensation issues in buildings with warm roofs, but I think that hybrid combination is out of my experience area, because we haven't used that Celotex in that way. So I couldn't say if by having used one product, by using another or having some sort of gap is going to be sufficient. I think probably because the nature of the material you've used for that insulation, you will have to think about the humidity in that space and how that moisture is handled when temperatures change. But I'm kind of out of my knowledge on that particular scenario.
So next question is by Andy on Facebook. Are there any double glazing grants for Southern Case windows available? I would actually point you towards Energy Saving Trust, maybe Home Energy Scotland, and also there are some grants available, I think, for if you're in a conservation area.
Yeah, some local authorities have conservation area schemes, and some city heritage trusts on some of the largest cities in Scotland will support homeowners with window repairs and upgrades. The short answer is most private individuals who are not in vulnerable categories don't get money directly for energy efficiency. That is the situation.
Yeah. Next question from Paul on Facebook. They have Victorian stone built farmhouse, concrete ground floor and wooden floors above. currently heated by oil and radiators. Is the heat pump a viable option, or are pellet burners a better way to go? But again, we're going into the not
I
our
think
territory.
this is a good question about insulating your building to a sufficient level that the heat pump will give you good results without a massive electricity bill. And I think the answer is there's probably a bit of insulation work to do if it's as it is. The glazing will be a big part of it, and that concrete floor, if that's an old concrete floor, particularly pre-1984, it's most unlikely to be insulated. The base of your walls are probably going to be damp as a consequence, so you might want to address that concrete floor as a stepping off point anyway. Again, I think a heat pump is probably an option once you've addressed some of the basic fabric measures, of which what we've done at the lodge is a good enough steer as any others. Whether you have a lime concrete floor or you reinstate a suspended timber floor, but certainly you'll need to bump up the insulation before the heat pump will work.
A good question about windows. Would you recommend slim double glazed retrofit units for such windows over full replacement?
That's a question of, firstly, the value of the glass, the historic value of the glass, or not, maybe just ordinary boring modern glass. The condition of the window, can you repair it? Remember, old wood in old windows is generally of a quality that sadly does not exist now. So if you can repair the defective bits. Thirdly, the nature of the unit that you put in, there's a big variety now. A few years ago, it was quite a restricted supply. There were conditions of considerations over quality and durability. There is a British standard for double glazing, and most slim profile or slim sightline, or whatever things they're called, are now compliant, including laminates, which are not quite such good performance as a two-pane option, but actually a quite a significant step up. So there's a range of things there, and including vacuum panes, which are extremely efficient, and the price of those is coming down, and they fit quite well in an existing sash. Again, if you've got the quality and got the repair done.
Great. A question from Helen on Facebook. They have a property that's 170 years old, rubble walls, but has cement rendering outside. It's in a good condition and they can't afford to remove it. What material would you recommend for internal walls behind a timber frame?
Cement is not a dirty word, and a cement render in good condition, possibly painted with good detailing at the chimney and the skew copes, does perfectly well. But sometimes they're not as good condition as you think, and they might have hairline cracking. That could be addressed with a mineral paint or some sort of interim option. But the inquirer is right. If you don't have that vapor open and breathability, your insulation options need thinking about carefully. For me, are the flues open? Is that wall dry? Usual things. What have you got as the internal lining? Is it lath and plaster, or is it vertical timber lining? If it's vertical timber lining, you might be able to remove that carefully, put some material in, possibly wood fiber, and put the vertical timber lining back in. Again, it's the nature of what you have to the interior and how easily you can take it down or put it back. As you can imagine, older plaster linings, you don't really take them down and put them back. So my preference obviously is retention of internal linings and upgrading, maybe with blow materials if the wall condition is good enough.
Thank you. Next question is from Damaris on Facebook. Does hemp fleece have an insect problem like fleece?
Probably not, because it's the keratin in the wool that our little flying friends are interested in, and hemp is essentially a woolly product, but it's made with a grown plant fiber strands. So the short answer is probably not, but that's perhaps something to take forward with the manufacturer.
Yeah. Another question by Dave on Facebook. On a Ability building, can cupola glazing be tweaked to have lower loss and fewer actual joints?
Cupolas are interesting, actually. They're sort of slightly unfashionable. Not that long ago, lighting was expensive, energy was expensive, coal was expensive, fuel was expensive, and lighting was expensive too. And natural light in buildings is a big deal for me, actually. I rant on about it rather. I think you can certainly adjust the glazing. Possibly vacuum panes would do well on a cupola. I think if you started to reduce the joints, you might end up tweaking the architectural form quite a bit. And I think that's where there might be a B-listing question there. Remember, you'll be changing something from a probably quite careful, thought out aesthetic design to something that will be cruder. So I would suggest certainly consider better glazing. Probably a laminate is there too, because that protects you against broken panes from sort of slate damage and bits and pieces. Also in cupolas, they had a ventilation function. A lot of your condensation in a cupola will be that the relative humidity is very high up there because the warm, moist air in your stairwell or in your flat has risen up to the highest point. And having a little bit of air egress, often through a sort of shaped vent at the top, is probably a good thing. But I think it's a fair comment about the glazing, and I'd say perhaps a laminate pane is probably a good thing, which reduces the U value down to about sort of 2.5, which will help with condensation and also reduce a little bit of cold downdraft from cold air against the glass.
Okay, we'll take one more question, the last one, and then anything that was too detailed or not relevant to this topic, we'll address them separately and we'll ask you to email us. So the last question is from Amanda on Facebook. Do you have any refurbishment case studies on buildings with cavity walls?
Very good question. Not really, because we've tended to stick to the pre-1919 stuff, because that was perceived as being the particular focus due to hard to treat. The cavity wall came in a little bit later, often sort of 1919 onwards, particularly the interwar social housing, which we have all over Scotland, which architecturally is of a really good quality. But as you say, it has quite often a cavity brick arrangement or similar. There are various stories about insulation in cavities. They were designed to be vented as a way of preventing moisture transition through to the inside face, which of course is really important when you've got a thin wall. And if you think Scottish walls are cold, you should see walls in England which are 2 bricks thick, sometimes even thinner. I mean, that is just rubbish, isn't it? Anyway, we don't have to talk about that. But with a later building, sometimes your internal linings are more ordinary, and you may have an option for a wood fibre maybe on the inside of your wall there. But the short answer is no, we haven't. And the answer is yes, we do need to get something, because there's a lot of really good quality social housing from the interwar period that has cavity walls, as you say, and needs looking at.
That's great, thank you. I think we're gonna stop here so we don't run over time and people don't get bored of us. But as I said, please email us at technicalresearch, all one word, at hes.scot if it's something that we haven't managed to answer here. And that's all we have time for today, but I would like to thank Roger for his excellent and very speedy responses.
And let's not forget, if any of you guys are in central Scotland, please come round to the space location 11th and 12th of November. We've got quite a few of the team there. We've got the training rigs, so you can look at some of these options in a kind of life-size model environment, and plenty of interesting presentations on embodied carbon, on circular economy, on my version of retrofit, which I'm calling conservation retrofit, where we're looking at the fabric, obviously, but also looking at the sort of the longer carbon tail of the measures, and also some of the technologies for heating, delivery of heat, and indeed power generation and power storage, which is a really important part if older buildings are going to get to net zero. And also you can hear about our embodied carbon work on specific building typologies, where we're hoping to look at the idea of a building carbon balance sheet, where you can take all the pros and cons of your building add them all together. Hopefully with older buildings, we've got lots of pros for you now, and say, look, this is the score on my card. Okay, I'm getting there, and I'm hoping we're not too far from net zero.
Just to also mention, today we talked about Hollywood Park Lodge, and we also, as part of COP26, we are giving 2 days of tours at the lodge. So we will pop the event page there, and there are 45-minute tours where you can actually hear a little bit more than what you heard today. You can actually touch the materials and see them in situ. So if you'd like that, you can it's free. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining.
What's the link to that? Is that Eventbrite? How do they get to that?
Yeah, I think we'll put the links in the chat. So it's both through Eventbrite and through the Engine Shed website. So I think we should have the links there shortly. But yeah, they're free to attend, and there are four tours a day if you are free and about in Edinburgh during those 2 days.
If you're at the old fire station at Lauriston Place, there's myself and my team there for those 2 days, so we can always chat then. Good.
So I would like to thank everyone for their excellent questions, and if you've enjoyed it, leave a comment, please, and follow us for more. And just to say, the next event for this year will be on the 3rd of December, so we're still keeping the theme of climate change. So the next one will be about climate change adaptations that you can do to your traditional buildings to cope better with the changing weather. So as always, thank you very much. Thank you for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day and your weekend. Goodbye.